Hello there, I'm Alex, and I sell cheese for a living. As a cheesemonger and certified cheese professional, I have helped thousands of customers find their favorite cheese. This week on the Modern Monger, I am going to talk all about monks. More specifically, it is about how monasteries quietly helped shape some of the most important foods in European history. We are talking about cheese, beer, wine, cured meats, preservation techniques, fermentation, agriculture, hospitality, and the strange reality that some of the people most associated with silence and restraint also created some of the boldest and strongest flavors on earth. This episode is going to explore how monasteries became centers of food production during the Middle Ages, why monks were often some of the most educated agricultural workers in Europe, and how religious practices accidentally pushed innovation in cheesemaking and fermentation. We are going to get into washed rind cheeses, Trappist beer, monastic wine traditions, aging caves, and the reason so many famous foods still carry abbey names hundreds of years later. And one of the fascinating things about this topic is that none of this was originally about luxury. A lot of these foods were born from necessity. Monasteries needed ways to preserve milk, as everyone did. They needed to feed travelers, to support themselves financially, survive winters, and make use of local ingredients. And what came out of that necessity ended up shaping food culture across entire regions. So today, let's go take a little trip into a monastery cellar. To understand why monks became so important to food history, you first have to understand what monasteries actually were during the Middle Ages. Today, it is easy to imagine monasteries as isolated spiritual retreats. Historically, though, many monasteries functioned almost like self-contained villages. They farmed land, raised animals, brewed beer, cultivated vineyards, copied books, treated the sick, hosted travelers, and managed massive agricultural operations. After the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, many regions in Europe became politically unstable. Monasteries often became places where knowledge survived. Monks preserved religious texts, but they also preserved agricultural techniques and food production methods. In many cases, monasteries had the stability, land, labor, and organization needed to experiment with farming and food preservation in ways ordinary villages could not. Many monastic orders followed the phrase ora et labora, meaning pray and work. Physical labor was considered spiritually valuable. Farming, brewing, baking, and cheesemaking were not distractions from religious life. They were considered a part of it. Monasteries also had another important advantage. They could read and write during a time when much of the general population could not. That literacy changed everything. Many ordinary farmers absolutely possessed deep practical knowledge, and countless food traditions originated in villages and rural communities. But oral traditions can disappear during war, famine, disease, or even political collapse. Monasteries were unusually stable institutions. Some existed continuously for hundreds of years. That continuity allowed monks to preserve information, compare results across generations, and gradually refine agricultural techniques over long periods of time. Monasteries also had another important advantage. They kept records. They took notes. If a certain washing technique improved cheese aging, monks wrote it down. If a vineyard produced better wine on a specific hillside, they would document that. If a beer recipe was successful, it was repeated and refined over generations. And that process starts to look surprisingly close to early scientific experimentation, just with food. Monks observed outcomes, documented processes, repeated techniques, and adjusted variables over time. They paid attention to the humidity, the cellar conditions, harvest timing, animal health, fermentation behavior, and seasonal changes. If a certain cave produced better cheese aging conditions, that information could be preserved. If a vineyard performed better after adjusting specific harvest dates, the monks could compare results year after year. If washing cheese rinds reduced spoilage or changed flavor in a positive way, the practice could become standardized within that monastery. Most medieval people simply did not have the luxury of maintaining that kind of long-term documentation, but the monasteries did. A farmer struggling through war, famine, or political instability might lose generations of knowledge, whereas a monastery often maintained continuity for centuries. And slowly, over time, monasteries became deeply associated with regional foods. That connection becomes especially obvious once we start talking about cheese, the whole reason we're here. Cheese and monasteries became connected for practical reasons long before they became connected culturally. No shocker here, but milk spoils quickly, and cheese preserves the nutrition needed. For monastic communities, raising cattle, sheep, or goats and transforming their milk into cheese allowed food to last longer and travel farther. It also created products that could be sold or traded to surrounding communities. Some of the most famous monastic cheeses developed in regions where monasteries had access to mountain pastures or caves, cool underground storage areas. These environments turned out to be ideal for cheese aging. Over time, the monks became highly skilled affineurs, even if they would not have used that word historically. One of the most famous examples is Port Salut, originally developed by Trappist monks in France during the 19th century. And I'll take a minute to stop here and say this is probably a good time to explain what Trappist actually means. The Trappists are a Catholic monastic order formerly known as the Order of Cistercians of the Strict Observance. The name comes from La Trappe Abbey in France, where reforms emphasizing simplicity, discipline, silence, and manual labor become strongly associated with that order. Over time, Trappist monasteries became especially well known for producing foods like cheese, beer, bread, and preserves as part of their self-sustaining way of life. Today, authentic Trappist products are still protected under strict standards. In order for something like a Trappist beer or cheese to carry the official designation, it must be connected directly to a monastery, produced under monastic supervision, and support the monastery or its charitable works rather than simply maximizing profit. That connection between labor, sustainability, and craftsmanship became one of the defining characteristics of monastic food culture. And once monasteries became known for producing reliable and respected foods, their influence spread far beyond the abbey walls. The cheese became known for its semi-soft texture and orange-washed rind. Like many monastery cheeses, the washing process encouraged the growth of specific surface bacteria that created stronger aromas and deeper savory flavors. And this is where the monastery cheese culture starts to intersect directly with science, preservation, and regional identity. Many monastic cheeses belong to the washed rind family. These cheeses are often very intense, earthy, meaty, and pungent. It can be overwhelming to people who are even very familiar with them. They can be strong flavored. And that creates one of the great contradictions in food history. The people associated with discipline, silence, and restraint helped popularize some of the loudest smelling foods ever made. Cheeses like Epoisse and Munster became famous partly because monks and monastic communities helped refine aging techniques and preserve regional traditions surrounding them. Munster, in particular, has a direct connection to monasteries built right into its name. The cheese originated in a region near a monastery founded in the 7th century. The word Munster comes from the Latin word monasterium, which eventually evolved into the French word Munster. The cheese became associated with monks and the surrounding valley communities that produced it. So if you've ever had Munster, think of monastery, monks, monk food. Munster is monastery cheese. Over time, local farmers and monastic communities developed the strong washed rind style that Munster is still known for today. The repeated washing of the rind encouraged powerful aromas and helped protect the cheese during aging. What began as a practical preservation technique eventually became one of the defining flavor profiles of its region. And that naming connection is important because it shows just how deeply monasteries became tied to the regional food identity. In some cases, the monastery did not just influence the food, it literally became the food's name. Washed rind cheeses relied on careful environmental management, and the wheels needed humidity, airflow, and repeated washing with either brine, alcohol, or local liquids. Many abbeys also became known for hospitality. Travelers and pilgrims passing through monasteries were often offered bread, beer, soup, or cheese. In some regions, monastic food traditions spread simply because people carried stories of those foods back home. And while monks were helping shape cheese culture through aging caves, washed rind, and careful record keeping, they were also transforming another fermented product that still carries monastic influence today. It's beer. Few foods are more closely associated with monasteries than beer. Part of that connection comes from sanitation. In medieval Europe, water was not always safe to drink. Brewing beer involved boiling the water, thus making it more reliable in many situations. Beer also contained calories and nutrients. During fasting periods, certain monastic communities consumed beer as a source of sustenance. This is where the famous phrase liquid bread enters the conversation. Some stronger monastery beers were intentionally nourishing. They were not necessarily designed for celebration. In many cases, they were designed to help sustain the monks during long fasting periods. Trappist monasteries became especially famous for brewing. Authentic Trappist beer is still produced under strict conditions tied directly to monastic oversight. The beers themselves became known for extraordinary complexity. Rich malt flavors, dark fruit notes, spice, caramelization, and bottle conditioning all became part of the tradition. And just like with cheese, monasteries succeeded partly because of the patience and the consistency. Beer requires timing. Fermentation requires observation. Brewing requires record keeping, and monks often had access to written knowledge that many other people did not. Monastic libraries preserved agricultural texts, medical writings, and practical observations copied across generations. That meant monasteries could build on existing knowledge rather than constantly starting over from scratch. Over time, monasteries became surprisingly close to agricultural research centers, not because the monks viewed themselves as scientists in the modern sense, but because the structure of monastic life naturally encouraged experimentation, consistency, patience, and refinement. There's also something fascinating about the relationship between silence and fermentation. A monastery cellar would have been full of slow, invisible transformations. Cheese aging quietly on shelves, the beer would be fermenting in some barrels, and the wine maturing in cool underground rooms. A huge amount of monastic food culture depended on waiting, allowing time itself to be an ingredient. Some of the same principles that would help monasteries create beautiful cheeses and breads and beers would also help them make amazing wines. Monasteries played an enormous role in preserving European winemaking traditions. In regions of France, Germany, Austria, and Italy, monks cultivated vineyards and carefully documented which grapes grew best in different soils and climates. The Cistercian monks of Burgundy became especially influential. They studied vineyard plots closely and helped establish ideas that would later evolve into concepts like terroir. Long before modern wine science existed, monastic communities observed how sunlight, elevation, drainage, and soil affected flavor. That level of observation helped shape some of the most important wine regions in the world. And again, necessity mattered. Wine had religious importance in Christianity, which meant monasteries had reason to preserve and improve viticulture. But monasteries also relied on vineyards economically. Producing the wine, the cheese, the beer, and other preserved foods allowed monasteries to support themselves financially and maintain influence within surrounding regions. This is also where the hospitality became central. Again, pilgrims, travelers, and visiting clergy often experienced regional foods through the monasteries. In many ways, the monasteries acted almost like early inns, farms, breweries, wineries, and research centers all wrapped into one. And because monasteries existed across Europe, food knowledge spread through monastic networks. What started as isolated communities became part of a larger culinary exchange. But monasteries were not only preserving food, they were shaping how people thought about food itself. And one of the reasons monastic food history feels so different from modern food culture is because food was rarely treated as entertainment first. In monastic life, food often existed within systems of ritual and discipline. Many monastic orders practiced fasting. Certain meats were restricted during part of the year. Simplicity was encouraged. Ironically, though, restrictions often create innovation. If meat consumption becomes limited, people improve preservation techniques for fish, dairy, grains, and fermented products. If luxury is discouraged, quality craftsmanship becomes more important. If waste is unacceptable, every ingredient used matters. And that mindset helped produce foods that were practical, but very deeply refined. Even some monastery architecture helped influence flavor. Underground caves created ideal aging environments for cheese. Thick stone walls stabilized temperature during fermentation. Cellars naturally maintained their humidity. Some monastery cheeses and beers became so tied strongly to specific locations that they eventually shaped regional identity. And centuries later, many of those foods still carry abbey names or monastic imagery. Even when modern factories produce versions of monastery cheeses, the branding often points back to the historical connection because people still associate monasteries with craftsmanship, patience, and tradition. There is also something deeply human about the hospitality aspect. Many monasteries fed travelers regardless of their status. All of the bread, cheese, beer, and soup became expressions of the care and of the community. And while not every monastery produced extraordinary food, enough of them did that the connection between monks and craftsmanship became permanently embedded in European culinary history. One of the most interesting parts of all of this is that monastic food traditions are not completely trapped in the past. There are still monasteries today producing cheese using methods connected directly to centuries-old traditions. At places like Westmalle Abbey in Belgium, monks still produce Trappist cheese tied to agricultural practices that date back to the 19th century. I'm probably going to butcher this one, but Abbaye de Citrus in France continues producing washed rind cheeses using traditional methods and local milk from Montbéliard cows. At Tamis Abbey in the French Alps, monks still make raw milk Alpine-style cheese aged in monastery cellars. And while many famous abbey cheeses are now commercially produced outside monastery walls, these surviving monastic producers prove something important. Old world techniques still work. You can still make some darn good products using just your hands and some time. The slow aging still matters. Raw milk can still create complexity in a product. Careful environmental control still helps shape the flavor. And hand washing rinds can still change aroma and texture. The patience all still matters as well. In an era of industrial food production and speed, there is something fascinating about the fact that some of the oldest food methods on Earth continue to produce cheeses respected all over the world. And maybe this is part of why monastery foods still capture people's imagination. Another cheese that I didn't mention so far is tête de moine, which tête de moine is another perfect example of how deeply monasteries influenced European cheese culture. The name literally translates to head of the monk, and the cheese originated at Bellelay Abbey in Switzerland sometime around the 12th century. For centuries, monks at the abbey produced the cheese as part of their agricultural life, and historical records even show it being used almost like currency or payment in certain regions. And what makes tête de moine especially unique is the way it is traditionally served. Instead of slicing it, the cheese is shaved into delicate rosettes using a device called a girolle. That shaving technique increases surface area, which changes the texture and aroma of the cheese dramatically. The rosettes become lighter, softer, and more aromatic than a standard slice. And honestly, it feels very connected to monastic food philosophy. Today, we talked about how monasteries became some of the most important food centers in medieval Europe. Not because the monks were trying to become celebrity chefs, but because they needed stable systems for survival, labor, preservation, and hospitality. And we explored how monks helped preserve agricultural knowledge after the fall of the Roman Empire, and how monastic communities became deeply involved in farming, brewing, winemaking, and cheese making. We talked about different wash rind cheeses, aging caves, Trappist beer, vineyard management, and the strange but wonderful reality that some of history's most disciplined religious communities helped create some of the boldest flavors in the culinary world. And I would think maybe the biggest takeaway from all of this is that many of the foods we think of as a little luxurious today began as very practical solutions to issues, mostly being cheese is preserved milk. Milk needed a way to be kept longer. I've said this over and over again. Beer helped provide calories and safer hydration, and the wine supported religious rituals and regional economies. Fermentation allowed food to survive, and what monasteries added was patience, organization, consistency, and most importantly, documentation. They treated the food seriously, not as a trend, but as part of everyday life. And hundreds of years later, their influence is still sitting on cheese boards, in wine glasses, and inside brewery cellars all over the world. Thank you for listening to this episode about monks and monasteries and all the goodies that come with them. My name is Alex, and this has been the Modern Monger.